This isn't a story about money. It might start with a $10,000 tip left on a greasy diner table, a fortune dropped like an anchor into the life of a woman who was already drowning. It might seem like it's about the woman, a waitress named Clara, who looked at that small mountain of cash and, with terror in her eyes, refused it. But it's not her story, not really. This story belongs to the small shadow who watched her do it, her 11-year-old son, Leo, a boy who decided that if his mother was too scared to accept a miracle, he would go out and wrestle one from the world with his bare hands. It's the story of how that boy, armed with nothing but a desperate love, walked into the den of the city's most feared biker club and made a plea. And it's the story of what happened next when one man's promise, a forgotten ghost, and a child's impossible courage unleashed 300 angels on iron horses, a tide of leather and chrome that descended not to break bones but to shatter a cage and prove once and for all that the most formidable families are not the ones we are born into, but the ones who show up when the entire world has turned its back. Leo was folded into the dark. He had made himself small, a knot of denim and frayed hoodie strings, tucked between a tower of canned tomato sauce and a leaning stack of industrial-sized bags of flour. The dry storage closet of the greasy spoon diner was his fortress, his hiding place, his after-school prison. It smelled of dust and cardboard and the faint, sweet scent of pancake syrup. From his perch on an overturned pickle bucket, he could see a sliver of the diner through the crack in the door. A long, thin rectangle of worn linoleum, the scuffed chrome leg of a single stool, and the hem of his mother's pale blue uniform as she paced back and forth, back and forth. He clutched a comic book in his lap, The Adventures of Captain Comet, a hero who could bend starlight with his mind. Leo wasn't reading it. The pages were soft and worn, the ink faded from 1,000 nervous readings. It was a talisman, a connection to a father he barely remembered, a man who, his mother said, also believed in heroes. Tonight, the diner was different, quieter. The usual closing time clatter of plates and the hiss of the grill had long since faded. Now there was only the low, monolithic hum of the walk-in freezer and the frantic, whispery sound of his mother's shoes on the floor. It was a silence that felt heavy, like a blanket smothering a fire. He should be at home. He knew that. He should be in his own bed, with the small nightlight casting spaceship shadows on his ceiling. But Mr. Henderson next door had raised his rates for babysitting, and the new apartment they'd moved into after leaving Rick was smaller, the walls thinner. So, 3 nights a week, this closet was his room. His mother said it was safer here, safer than home, safer than anywhere Rick might think to look for them. Leo didn't feel safe. He felt like a secret, a piece of luggage his mother had to stash away so she could work. The bell over the diner door had jingled almost an hour ago, signaling the departure of the last customer. A man Leo had watched through the crack. He was huge, a mountain in a leather vest covered in patches. His beard was a wild, dark forest, and tattoos spilled down his forearms like inked rivers. He had been quiet, nursing a single cup of black coffee for 2 hours, his eyes seeming to watch everything and nothing at all. Leo had seen his mother approach the man's table to clear it. He saw her stop. Just stop. Her body went rigid. Her hand, holding a damp rag, froze in midair. Leo leaned forward, pressing his eye closer to the crack, his breath fogging the cool metal of the door. On the table, next to an empty mug and a crumpled napkin, was a stack of $100 bills, a thick, impossible brick of money. It wasn't just a big tip, it was a rescue. It was new shoes for him, the kind that didn't have cardboard lining the soles. It was a full grocery cart. It was the rent, paid on time, without the pleading phone call to the landlord. It was the frantic, worried lines on his mother's forehead finally smoothing out. He saw the hope ignite in her eyes, a brilliant, dazzling flash. It was a look he hadn't seen in years, a look from before Rick, before the yelling, before the constant, gnawing fear. And then just as quickly he saw it extinguished. The hope vanished, snuffed out by a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. It was a physical transformation. Her shoulders slumped. The light in her eyes died. Her face, for a breathtaking moment so full of life, became a pale, blank mask. She backed away from the table slowly, as if the money were a venomous snake poised to strike. That was when the back office door creaked open. Rick emerged, wiping his greasy hands on his apron. He was a man made of soft edges and hard eyes. His smile was a thin, predatory slash that never, ever reached them. He was the owner of the Greasy Spoon. He was his mother's boss. He was the man they had run from, only to end up right back in his cage. Problem, Clara. Rick's voice was slick with false concern. He saw the money on the table, and his eyes, small and piggy, lit with a greedy fire. He, he left this, Clara whispered, her voice a threadbare thing. It has to be a mistake. No mistake, Rick said, scooping up the stack of bills with a practiced flick of his wrist. He fanned them out, his thumb stroking the crisp paper. Looks like a $10,000 tip to me. Our best one yet. I can't take it, Clara said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Rick, please, I can't. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. Take it, Mom, he pleaded silently, his small hands clenched into fists. Please, just take it and we can go. Rick's smile widened, but it was all teeth. Of course you can take it, sweetheart. It's yours, but you know the rules. Big tips like this, they can cause complications. Taxes, paperwork. You know how you are with numbers. He patted her arm in a gesture that was meant to look fatherly, but was purely possessive. I'll hold on to it for you. Keep it safe. We'll square up at the end of the month. Like always. Like always. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisoned. Leo understood. He understood perfectly. Squaring up meant they would never see a penny. Keeping it safe meant it was gone forever. It was the same thing that happened to her smaller tips. The same thing that happened to the birthday money his grandmother had sent. The same thing that happened to every extra dollar she ever managed to earn. Rick would hold on to it, and it would dissolve into the ether, absorbed into his endless list of Clara's debts and expenses. It was a theft so clean, so casual, it was almost elegant. A magic trick where the magician showed you exactly how it was done, and you were still powerless to stop it. Clara's face crumpled. A single tear traced a path through the exhaustion on her cheek. She didn't argue. She never argued anymore. She just nodded, a tiny, defeated gesture. Okay, Rick, she breathed. He pocketed the money, gave her another one of his venomous smiles, and retreated back into his office, the door clicking shut like the lock on a cell. From his hiding spot, Leo felt a rage so hot and pure it almost made him dizzy. It was an adult anger in a child's body, and he didn't know what to do with it. He watched his mother stand there for a long moment, her body trembling. Then, with a shuddering sigh, she picked up her rag and began to wipe down the table where the miracle had briefly landed, erasing any trace that it had ever been there at all. Later that night, the apartment was a tomb of silence. The thin walls did nothing to block out the sounds from the street below. The distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a late-night bus. But inside, there was only the sound of his mother's quiet, choked sobs coming from her bedroom. It was a sound Leo knew well. It was the soundtrack to their life. He lay in his own small bed, the springs digging into his back, staring at the ceiling. The anger from the diner had cooled into something harder, something heavier. Desperation. He felt like Captain Comet, facing a black hole that was sucking all the light and hope from his universe. But he had no powers. He had no starlight to bend. He was just a kid, a small, scared kid. But his father had believed in heroes. The thought was a spark in the darkness. He sat up. His mother had cleaned out the diner, but in her haste, she had missed something. The crumpled napkin the big biker had left on the table. She had swept it into the trash bag with the other refuse of the day, a bag that now sat by their apartment door, waiting to be taken out in the morning. Leo slipped out of bed, his bare feet silent on the cold linoleum floor. He crept to the door and carefully, quietly untied the knot on the trash bag. The smell of cold coffee grounds and discarded food hit him, but he ignored it. He rummaged through the damp paper and food scraps until his fingers brushed against it. He pulled out the napkin and smoothed it on the floor in the dim glow of his nightlight. In the center of the napkin, drawn in thick black marker, was a logo. It was a shield, forged of what looked like wrought iron. And inside the shield, roaring with silent fury, was the snarling head of a grizzly bear. Beneath it, in stark block letters, were two words, Iron Guardians, his mother's words from the diner echoed in his head. When she had first seen the tip, in that one bright moment of hope, she had whispered something to herself, something Leo had barely caught. An angel. She had been talking about the biker, the man with the tattoo rivers and the forest beard. An angel, but she had been too scared to accept his help. Leo stared at the roaring bear on the napkin. It didn't look like an angel. It looked powerful. It looked dangerous. It looked like the opposite of Rick. And in that moment, a decision formed in his heart, solid and terrifying and absolutely clear. If his mother couldn't accept the help, he would go and ask for it himself. He would find this Iron Guardian. He would find this angel in a leather vest, and he would tell him what Rick had done. He folded the napkin carefully, as if it were a sacred text, and tucked it into his pocket. He pulled on his worn sneakers, not bothering with the laces, and grabbed the thin jacket that was never warm enough. He took one last look toward his mother's room. The crying had stopped. He imagined her curled up in bed, exhausted and defeated, a general who had surrendered after a war she never had a chance of winning. "I'll be your hero, Mom," he thought, the vow of fierce, silent burn in his chest. "I'll fix it." Then, moving with a stealth born of years of trying not to wake her, he slipped out the door and into the cold, dark maw of the city night. The city at night was a different beast. By day, it was a place of buses and shoppers and pigeons. At 2 in the morning, it was a concrete jungle ruled by shadows and whispers. The wind, funneled between the tall buildings, had teeth. It bit at his cheeks and wormed its way through the thin fabric of his jacket, raising goosebumps on his arms. Every streetlight was a lonely island of safety in an ocean of darkness. He scurried from one to the next, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The world was populated by giants, a man sleeping in a doorway wrapped in newspapers, a group of teenagers laughing too loudly on a corner, their faces hidden by hoodies, a sanitation truck that roared past him like a mechanical monster, its air brakes hissing like a dragon. He had no idea where he was going. The industrial district. That's all he knew. He'd heard Rick talking on the phone once, complaining about the noise from the grease monkeys and biker gangs down by the old cannery. He headed in that direction, using the distant glow of the port lights as his compass. It felt like walking for 100 years. His legs ached. The initial fire of his resolve had chilled to a low, stubborn ember. Fear was a constant companion, a cold hand on the back of his neck. More than once, he almost turned back. He thought of his warm bed, of the futility of it all. What could he possibly do? He was a gnat trying to get the attention of a lion. But then he would picture his mother's face, the way the light had died in her eyes, the single, silent tear, and he would keep walking. The landscape changed. The bright storefronts and apartment buildings gave way to sprawling, dark warehouses with broken windows like vacant eyes. The air grew thick with the smell of diesel and rust and the faint, salty tang of the nearby sea. Chain-link fences topped with barbed wire loomed on either side of him. This was the place. And then he saw it. It wasn't a building so much as a brick fortress, a low-slung, windowless structure that seemed to absorb the light around it. Parked in a neat, formidable line out front were at least 24 motorcycles. They gleamed under a single, buzzing floodlight, chrome and steel, sleeping like a herd of metallic beasts. Above the heavy, riveted steel door was a sign, weathered and old, but unmistakable in the gloom. It was the same design as the one on the napkin. An iron shield, a roaring bear, the Iron Guardians Motorcycle Club. Leo's breath caught in his throat. His legs felt like lead. This was it, the lion's den. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to go back to the relative safety of his life. But the image of his mother's defeated face was burned onto the back of his eyelids. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. He walked up the short concrete steps, his sneakers feeling impossibly loud in the silence. The door was massive, made of thick, dark wood bound with iron straps. There was no handle, just a small, grated peephole. He was too small to reach it. Panic began to bubble in his chest. He had come all this way. He couldn't fail now. He balled his small hand into a fist and, summoning every ounce of his courage, he knocked on the thick, unyielding wood. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was pathetic, swallowed by the sheer size of the door. He knocked again, harder this time, the impact jarring his wrist. For a long moment, nothing happened. He was about to give up, to shrink back into the shadows, when he heard a metallic scrape. The peephole slid open. He couldn't see the eye behind it, but he could feel it. He was being watched, scrutinized. Then a sound like a tomb opening. A series of heavy bolts were drawn back, one after another. Clank, shunk, clank. The massive door groaned open a few inches, revealing a sliver of warm, noisy light in a wall of black leather. A man even bigger than the one from the diner filled the doorway. He had a shaved head and a braided beard that reached his chest. He looked down at Leo, his expression not angry, but utterly, blankly baffled. "We're closed," the man rumbled, his voice like rocks grinding together. Leo's own voice was trapped in his throat. He opened his mouth, but only a squeak came out. The man started to close the door. "Wait!" The word burst out of Leo, louder than he expected. The door stopped. The giant looked down at him again, a flicker of something, annoyance, curiosity, in his eyes. I I need to speak to the Iron Guardian," Leo stammered, his words clumsy. The man's eyebrow raised. "You're speaking to about 100 of them. Which one?" The one, the one who was at the Greasy Spoon diner tonight," Leo said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "The one who left the tip." The giant stared at him for a long, silent moment. Then, without a word, he turned his head and bellowed into the room behind him. "Deacon, front and center, you got a visitor." The door opened wider and the giant stepped aside. Leo stepped across the threshold, and it felt like entering another world. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, leather, and cigarette smoke. Loud, angry music blasted from speakers in the corners. The room was vast, a cavernous space filled with pool tables, rough-hewn wooden tables, and people. So many people, men and women, all clad in the same uniform of denim and leather, their vests adorned with the roaring bear patch. They were covered in tattoos, piercings, and scars. They were loud. They were laughing. They were arguing. They were a sea of intimidating, raw power. And as Leo stepped into the room, it all stopped. The music screeched to a halt as someone cut the power. The laughter died. The argument ceased. The clack of pool balls stopped mid-game. It was as if a switch had been flipped. 100 conversations died at once, and 100 pairs of eyes, hard and curious and suspicious, all turned to fixate on the small, trembling boy standing in the doorway. The silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was absolute, suffocating. Leo felt like a mouse that had just wandered into a pride of lions. His skin prickled. He wanted to run, but his feet were glued to the floor. Then a path opened through the crowd. The biker from the diner, Deacon, was walking toward him. Up close, he seemed even bigger. But his eyes, when they met Leo's, weren't angry. They were filled with a deep, weary confusion. "Kid, what are you doing here?" Deacon asked, his voice softer than Leo had expected. "It's the middle of the night. Your mom know you're here?" Leo shook his head, his throat too tight to speak. From the back of the room, a voice cut through the silence, low and calm, but carrying an authority that was absolute. "Let the boy speak." The crowd parted further, and Leo saw him. He was sitting at the bar on a stool that looked like a throne. He was older than the others, his beard shot through with gray. He was massive, not just tall, but broad, a creature of pure, solid mass. His vest was worn, the patch faded, as if he had been wearing it for a lifetime. His face was a roadmap of hard living, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. They weren't angry or amused, they were just watching, waiting. This was the king of the lions, the bear on the patch, made flesh. Deacon gently guided Leo forward, toward the bar, toward the man who commanded the room with his silence. The bikers shifted, moving out of the way, but their eyes followed him, 100 burning points of light in the dim room. Leo stopped a few feet from the bar. He had to crane his neck to look up at the man. "What's your name, son?" the big man asked, his voice a low rumble like a distant engine. "Leo, sir," he said, the "sir" coming out automatically, a relic of his mother's constant lessons in politeness. "I'm Grizz," the man said simply. He gestured to the stool next to him. "Have a seat." Tell me why a boy like you is out wandering the city at this hour. Leo couldn't climb onto the stool. His legs were shaking too much. So he just stood there, his small body trembling under the weight of 100 stares. He took a shaky breath and pulled the crumpled napkin from his pocket, placing it on the bar. "You're the Iron Guardians," he said, his voice small but clear in the cavernous silence. Grizz glanced at the napkin, then back at Leo. He nodded slowly. "We are." And then the story came pouring out of him. It wasn't eloquent. It was a jumbled, desperate torrent of words. He talked about his mom, how hard she worked, how tired she always was. He talked about Rick, about the stolen tips, the constant fear, the feeling of being trapped. He told them about the $10,000 tip, about the flash of hope in his mother's eyes, and the way Rick had snatched it away, both the money and the hope. She said you were an angel," Leo said, his voice cracking, looking at Deacon. "But she was too scared to take the help because of him. He takes everything. He always takes everything, and she lets him because she's afraid. But it's not fair." The last words were a cry, a raw burst of a child's outrage at an unjust world. "It's not fair," he repeated, softer this time, the tears he had been fighting back finally beginning to fall. "She deserves a miracle. She works so hard." He stood there crying silently, his small shoulders shaking, utterly exposed in the den of giants. The silence in the room stretched on, thick and heavy. No one moved, no one spoke. Grizz just watched him, his expression unreadable. Leo felt a fresh wave of despair. It had been a stupid idea, a crazy childish fantasy. These weren't angels, they were just big, scary men who were probably laughing at him on the inside. He had failed. Then Grizz spoke, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "Deacon, the tip. Why so much?" Deacon shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "It was for Davy," he said, his voice low. "Anniversary of his passing. I saw her. Clara. I recognized her from back then. Figured she could use it. I didn't know. I didn't know she was tangled up with a guy like that." Grizz's eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned forward, his massive forearms resting on the bar. His gaze was fixed on Leo. "Leo," he said, his voice softer now. "What's your last name?" "Hale," Leo whispered, wiping his nose on the sleeve of his jacket. "Leo Hale." The name fell into the room like a stone into a deep, still pond. Grizz froze. It wasn't a big movement, just a stillness, a sudden, complete cessation of all motion. His hands, which had been resting on the bar, clenched slowly into fists the size of cinder blocks. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. The watchful curiosity in his eyes was gone, replaced by something else, something ancient and cold and dangerous. "David Hale," Grizz said. The name not a question, but a statement. A memory dragged up from a deep, dark place. He looked around the room, his eyes locking with some of the older members, men with as much gray in their beards as he had. He saw the same dawning horror, the same sudden, sickening recognition on their faces. "Davy," one of the old-timers breathed, the name a ghost in the smoky air. Grizz's gaze snapped back to Leo. He wasn't looking at a strange kid anymore. He was looking at a relic, a promise, a failure. Davy Hale. He had been a prospect almost 2 decades ago, a good kid, full of fire and loyalty, with a laugh that could fill a room and a fierce devotion to the club's code. He had a young wife, Clara, and a baby on the way. He was one of them. He was family, and he had died. A senseless accident on the job, a scaffolding collapse at a construction site. He was gone before they could ever stitch the roaring bear patch onto his vest. The club had mourned him. They had ridden for him, and they had made a promise. They had set up a fund for his widow and his unborn child, a promise to watch over them, to make sure they were always safe, to be the family he no longer could. But time was a cruel thief. Clara, young and grieving, had moved away, wanting a fresh start. She'd remarried. The letters stopped. The calls went unanswered. Over the years, the memory faded, the promise buried under new prospects, new troubles, new battles. They had lost her. They had failed. And now here was the proof of their failure, standing before him, with his father's eyes and a story of abuse and theft that curdled the blood. The son of their fallen brother was living in a closet, and his mother was being bled dry by some parasite named Rick. The quiet amusement Grizz might have felt at a child's plea was gone, burned away by a white-hot, righteous rage. This wasn't about a stranger's tip anymore. This wasn't about helping a random waitress. This was about family. It was about a debt of honor that had come due. Slowly, deliberately, Grizz slid off his stool. He moved with a grace that was surprising for a man his size. He walked around the bar and knelt down in front of Leo, the worn leather of his knees creaking. He was still huge, a mountain of a man, but now he was on the boy's level. The gesture was one of immense respect. He placed a hand on Leo's small, trembling shoulder. The hand was massive, calloused, and covered in scars, but the touch was unbelievably gentle. "Leo," Grizz said, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated through the boy's entire body. It was the calmest, most terrifyingly resolute sound Leo had ever heard. "You listen to me now. Your father was our brother. He was blood. We lost you, and that is a shame we will carry forever. But we have found you now." He leaned in closer, his gaze intense, unwavering. "That makes you our blood. Your mother is our family. This man, this Rick, his time preying on you is over. It is done. This ends tonight. I promise you. I promise you, on the memory of your father, you will be safe." The words were a vow, an unbreakable oath sworn in a room full of witnesses. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact. The sun would rise in the morning, and Rick's hold on their lives would be broken. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Leo felt a crack in the wall of fear that had surrounded his heart. Through that crack, a tiny, brilliant ray of hope shone through. The man kneeling before him wasn't just a big, scary biker. He was a king, and he had just declared war on Leo's monster. The tension in Leo's small body finally snapped. The adrenaline, the fear, the exhaustion, the sudden, overwhelming relief. It all came crashing down on him at once. A sob tore from his throat, loud and raw, and he launched himself forward, burying his face in the rough, leathery expanse of Grizz's vest. He cried. He wept for his mother, for his lost father, for every night he'd spent huddled in the dark. He cried out all the fear and all the loneliness, his small fists clutching the thick leather as if it were the only solid thing in the universe. Grizz didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply let the boy cry, his huge hand resting steady and warm on the back of Leo's head. He was a living shield, an immovable mountain, and for the first time, Leo felt truly, completely safe. Around them, the silent, watching bikers began to move. But it wasn't threatening. A woman with kind eyes and a long, graying braid came forward. She had a patch on her vest that read Doc. She knelt beside Grizz. "Let's get him warmed up, Grizz," she said softly. Someone else appeared with a heavy club jacket, the leather worn and soft, smelling of engine oil, and the open road. They draped it over Leo's shoulders. It was enormous, swallowing him whole, the sleeves dangling a foot past his hands. But it was warm, so wonderfully warm. Another biker, a man with a gentle face that seemed at odds with his skull tattoos, pressed a steaming mug into his hands. "Hot chocolate there, kid. Extra marshmallows." Leo, his sobs quieting to shuddering breaths, was gently guided to a large, comfortable armchair that had been cleared for him. He sat huddled in the massive jacket, sipping the sweetest, richest hot chocolate he had ever tasted. He was surrounded, but it was no longer the terrifying circle of lions. It was a wall of protectors. He was in the center of the shield. Grizz stood up, his face set like granite. The room, which had softened for a moment, went rigid with attention again. Every eye was on him, waiting. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He just looked at the man with the shaved head and braided beard who had first opened the door, the club's sergeant at arms. "Rocco," Grizz said, his voice flat and cold. "Call them." That was all he said. 2 words. Rocco nodded once, his expression grim. He pulled out a battered flip phone, a relic from another era, but one that was brutally effective. He pressed a single button. "It's a code, Jericho," Rocco said into the phone, his voice devoid of emotion. "All hands. Clubhouse. Now." He ended the call and began to text, his thumbs moving with practiced speed. sending the same message out to a long list of contacts. A silent digital call to arms. For a few minutes, the only sound in the room was the clicking of Rocco's phone and Leo's quiet sniffles. And then the sound began. It started as a low, distant hum. A vibration felt more than heard, a tremor in the concrete floor. Leo felt it in the soles of his feet. It grew steadily, resolving itself into a distinct sound, the rumble of motorcycle engines. Not one or two, dozens. The rumble grew into a roar, a wave of sound that washed over the industrial park, shaking the very walls of the clubhouse. It was the sound of an approaching storm, a man-made thunderstorm of steel and combustion. Leo, clutching his mug, looked toward the door. Through the open crack, he saw the first headlights appear, cutting sharp white blades through the darkness. Then two more. Then 10, then 20. It was a river of light, a flood of chrome. Bikes poured into the lot from every direction, their engines a synchronized, throbbing chorus of raw power. They moved with a disciplined grace, filing into neat rows, flanking the bikes that were already there. Harleys, Indians, custom choppers, a gleaming, formidable armada. The bikers dismounted. Men and women of all ages, all shapes, all sizes. They moved with a quiet, shared purpose. There was no chatter, no shouting. They just got off their bikes, their faces grim and set, and walked toward the clubhouse, their boots crunching on the gravel. The room began to fill, and fill, and fill. What had been a large crowd now became a standing room-only legion. The air grew thick with the collective presence of so much focused intent. Leo, small in his armchair, watched in stunned awe as the number swelled. 50 became 100, 100 became 200, and still they came. Leo had seen a nature documentary once about the great wildebeest migration. 1,000,000 animals moving as one, a single organism driven by a single instinct. This was like that, a migration of leather and denim, a gathering of the clan. Finally, the last bike went silent. The river of headlights died down. Rocco stepped up to Grizz. 312, Prez, he reported. All chapters accounted for. 300. 300 angels, just like his mother had said. But they had the faces of warriors. Grizz nodded. He walked to the center of the room and a space cleared around him. He didn't need a platform. His presence was enough. When he spoke, his voice was still that low, calm rumble, but it carried to every corner of the packed room, cutting through the thick silence. An hour ago, he began, a boy walked into our house, the son of David Hale. A murmur went through the crowd, a wave of recognition and anger. The name still meant something. For almost 12 years, Grizz continued, his voice hardening, Davy's son and his wife have been living in hell, prey to a coward who has been stealing from them, controlling them, tormenting them. We made a promise to Davy, a promise to this club. We broke that promise. We lost them. Tonight that changes. Tonight we pay our debt. His eyes swept the room, meeting the gaze of every man and woman there. But let me be clear, he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more intense. This is not a bar fight. This is not a brawl. We are not a mob. We are guardians. We are a promise. He laid out the plan, his words sharp, precise, and absolute. They would move in two waves. The first wave would be a silent cordon. The second would be the voice. When the sun comes up, he said, this man, this Rick, he will open his diner, and he will find us waiting, 100 of us. You will form a perimeter. You will not block his business. You will not speak to his customers. You will not touch his property. You will simply be there. You will stand. You will watch. You are a presence, not a fist. Your silence will be your weapon. He paused, letting the words sink in. The second wave will be with me. We will handle the conversation, a few of us. Deacon, Rocco, and Bones, he said, nodding to a wiry man with glasses who looked more like an accountant than a biker. Bones has the paperwork. This will be clean. It will be legal. We are here to liberate, not to conquer. He looked directly at Leo, who was watching him with wide, awestruck eyes. We are here to bring a boy's mother home, Grizz finished. This coward, it has built himself a tiny kingdom on the back of a grieving woman. Tomorrow morning, Iadam Morning, we will dismantle it, brick by brick, without laying a single hand on him. Is that understood? A low, rumbling chorus of yes, Prez filled the room. It was the sound of a loyal army, disciplined and ready. Good, Grizz said. Get some coffee. The sun comes up in 3 hours. We ride at dawn. The next morning was gray and cold, the sky the color of dishwater. Clara unlocked the front door of the Greasy Spoon, her movements slow and heavy, as if she were wading through mud. She hadn't slept. The image of the $10,000 and Rick's smug face as he pocketed it had played on a loop in her mind all night. Worse, Leo was gone. His bed was empty. A cold knot of panic had been tightening in her stomach for hours. She had called his school, his friends' parents, the police. Nothing. The fear for her son was a physical pain, far sharper than any worry about money. She flipped the open sign, her hand trembling. Rick was already in his office, probably counting his new treasure. The thought made her sick. She was filling the salt shakers, her mind a whirlwind of terror and despair, when the sound started. The same low rumble from the night before, but this time it was in broad daylight. She looked out the large front window of the diner, and her heart stopped. It was them, the bikers. They were coming down the street, a slow, deliberate procession. Not fast, not loud, just coming. They filled the entire road, a river of dark leather and gleaming chrome under the flat morning light. One by one they began to park. They lined the street on both sides. They filled the parking lot of the abandoned grocery store across the road. They formed a perfect, silent cordon around the entire block. They didn't rev their engines. They didn't shout. They simply cut the power, dismounted, and stood by their bikes. 100 of them. 100 silent sentinels in leather vests, all with the same roaring bear on their backs. They didn't block the diner's entrance. They didn't menace the few early morning pedestrians who scurried past, their eyes wide. They just stood there, arms crossed, watching the front of the Greasy Spoon. The back office door flew open. Rick stormed out, his face puced with rage. "What the hell is this?" he snarled, looking out the window. "Is this some kind of joke?" Clara couldn't answer. She was frozen, her hand clutching a salt shaker so tightly her knuckles were white. Rick, fueled by an arrogance that knew no bounds, shoved past her and threw open the diner door. He marched outside, puffing out his chest, ready to do battle. "Hey, you can't park here," he yelled, his voice sounding small and shrill in the open air. "This is private property. You're harassing my business. I'm calling the cops." No one answered. No one even looked at him. They just continued to stand, a silent, unmovable wall of judgment. Just then, a second group of bikes pulled up. This group was smaller, only 5 or 6. They parked directly in front of the diner. Grizz dismounted, moving with that same deliberate calm. He was flanked by Deacon, Rocco, and the man called Bones. And holding Grizz's hand, looking small but no longer afraid, was Leo. "Leo!" Clara cried, a sob of pure relief escaping her. She dropped the salt shaker and ran outside, pushing past Rick. She fell to her knees on the pavement and pulled her son into a desperate, crushing hug. "Oh, my baby, where have you been? I was so worried." "I'm okay, Mom," Leo said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I'm okay. I went to get help. I told them." Clara looked up, her eyes full of tears, at the mountain of a man who held her son's other hand. She looked at his vest, at the roaring bear, and she understood. This was the king of the angels. Grizz gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of reassurance before turning his attention to Rick, who was sputtering, his face a mask of confused fury. "You," Grizz said, his voice quiet, yet it cut through the air like a razor. "You are Rick." "Who's asking?" Rick blustered, trying to regain his footing. "This is my property. You and your gang of thugs need to leave right now." Grizz took a slow step forward. He didn't threaten. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply closed the distance, his sheer size and the force of his presence a physical blow. Rick involuntarily took a step back. "You have something," Grizz said, his voice a deadly calm, "that belongs to the son of David Hale. You have something that belongs to his wife, and you have something that belongs to us." "I don't know what you're talking about," Rick sneered, but a flicker of fear had finally entered his eyes. He was starting to realize this was not a situation he could control. "Let me refresh your memory," Grizz said. He nodded to Bones, the accountant biker. Bones stepped forward. He was holding a thin, leather-bound ledger. He opened it. "According to our records," he said, his voice crisp and professional, "the Iron Guardians established a survivors fund for the family of David Hale on June 12, 2008. It was seeded with $25,000. Over the next 6 years, we made regular contributions." He looked up, his glasses catching the light. "We lost contact with Mr. Hale's widow after her remarriage to you. Funny thing that," Bones continued, his voice relentless. "Furthermore, we have acquired sworn statements from 3 former employees of this establishment detailing a systematic pattern of wage theft and extortion, specifically regarding cash tips, a practice you seem to have perfected on Clara Hale." He pulled another document from his satchel. "This is a detailed calculation of the money you have extorted from her over the past 5 years, including the $10,000 you stole from her last night. With interest and penalties for theft and fraud, it comes to a grand total of $142,650, a sum you will be repaying today." Rick's face went from red to a pasty, sickly white. He looked from the ledger to the 100 silent bikers surrounding him. He looked at Grizz's cold, unblinking eyes. The bravado, the arrogance, the petty tyranny, it all evaporated in an instant, leaving behind only a terrified, cornered little man. "This is insane," he stammered. "You can't prove any of this." "We don't have to," Grizz said calmly. "Bones here is also a forensic accountant, and that man over there," he gestured to another biker, a clean-cut man in a crisp shirt under his vest, "is a partner at the city's top law firm. We have everything we need to bury you in litigation for the next decade, to have your books audited by the IRS, to open a criminal investigation into racketeering and extortion." Grizz took another step closer, his shadow falling over Rick. "Or," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "you can make it right now." The choice was not a choice. It was an execution, and Rick was being allowed to select the method. His tiny empire built on fear and intimidation was crumbling around him. He had only ever bullied those who were weaker than him. Now, for the first time in his life, he was facing a power so far beyond his comprehension that he could barely breathe. He stared wild-eyed at the sea of leather and denim. There was no escape. What do you want?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "You will go inside," Grizz commanded, his voice returning to its normal, calm volume. "You will bring out the $10,000 from last night. You will bring out every dollar of cash you have in that office. Then you will sign 2 documents. The first transfers ownership of this diner, free and clear to Clara Hale. The second is a full confession of your crimes, which our lawyer will hold as insurance against you ever bothering this family again." Rick just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Now," Grizz said. The word was not a request. It was a force of nature. Scrambling like a frightened rat, Rick turned and fled back into the diner. A few minutes later, he reappeared, carrying a metal cash box and a sheaf of papers. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold them. He thrust the box at Grizz. Grizz didn't take it. He gestured to Clara. "It belongs to her." Hesitantly, Clara took the box. It was heavy. Rick shoved the papers at Bones, who took them and produced a pen. "Sign here and here," Bones said, his voice bored, as if he were closing a simple real estate deal. Rick scribbled his signature, his hand a frantic scrawl. As soon as he was done, the biker lawyer stepped forward, his phone already to his ear. "Yes, detective," the lawyer said calmly. "I'd like to report a situation. We have a man here who has just confessed to multiple counts of extortion and fraud. We've secured him for you. 124 Miller Street, the Greasy Spoon. No trouble at all. We'll wait." He hung up. The trap was sprung. The cage was locked. The bikers hadn't laid a hand on Rick, but they had dismantled his life with surgical precision. Clara stood clutching the cash box, looking at her son, then at the deed to the diner in Bones' hand, then at the 100 silent angels standing guard. The enormity of it all washed over her. The years of fear, of walking on eggshells, of feeling the walls close in around her. I don't. Sirash Omanyam. It was over. It was all over. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in a decade, they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of release, of catharsis, of a dawn she thought would never come. She looked at Grizz, her voice choked with emotion. Why? She whispered, the question she had been holding in her heart. Why would you do all of this for us? Grizz's hard expression finally softened. He looked down at Leo, who was still standing proudly by his side, and then back at her. Your husband David, he said, his voice losing its iron edge, was one of us. In his heart, he was an iron guardian. We made a promise to look after our own. For a long time, we failed that promise. We are a brotherhood, Clara, and we let our brother's family suffer. That is a stain on our honor. He placed his huge hand on Leo's head, his touch gentle. This boy, he said, his voice thick with a pride that was almost paternal. He came to us in the middle of the night, scared but not broken. He reminded us what this patch on our vests really means. He looked her right in the eye, and she saw not a dangerous biker, but a man of profound, unshakable principle. Family isn't just about blood, Clara. It's about a promise. It's about showing up. Leo is the son of our brother. That makes you our family. And we always, always protect our family. He then took a small object from his pocket. It was a pendant on a thick silver chain, a miniature version of the club's patch, a tiny, perfect iron shield with a roaring bear's head. He knelt down again in front of Leo. This makes it official, Grizz said, his voice soft. He placed the chain around Leo's neck. You're an Iron Guardian now, kid. The bravest one we've got. You ever need anything, anything at all, you touch this shield and we will hear you. Leo looked down at the cool, heavy metal resting on his chest. He looked up at Grizz, at his mom, at the army of protectors standing watch over them. He wasn't a secret in a closet anymore. He was a hero, his father's son, a guardian. Grizz stood and turned to Clara. He handed her a set of keys. The diner is yours. It's a clean start. Then he handed her a checkbook. We also reestablished David's fund. Bones has been managing it. It's for Leo's education, for your future, for whatever you need. You will never have to worry again. The police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The 100 silent bikers began to quietly, efficiently mount their bikes. Their job was done. Justice had been delivered, not with a fist, but with a promise. As the first police car pulled up, the engines began to roar to life, a triumphant, thunderous chorus. Grizz gave Leo's shoulder one last squeeze, nodded to Clara, and swung his leg over his own massive bike. With a final deafening roar that shook the entire street, the river of chrome and steel began to flow away, disappearing back into the city as quietly as it had arrived, leaving behind a stunned woman, a brave little boy, and the keys to a new life. 1 year later, the greasy spoon was gone. In its place stood Davy's Place. The sign out front was new, painted in bright, welcoming colors, and underneath the name was a small, proud logo, a roaring bear inside an iron shield. The inside was transformed. It was bright, clean, and always full. The smell of grease was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh coffee, baking bread, and happiness. Clara was at the register, laughing with a customer. The worried lines on her forehead were replaced by laugh lines at the corners of her eyes. She moved with a confidence and a lightness that made her seem like a different person. Leo was at a booth in the corner, doing his homework. He was taller, his face having lost some of its childish roundness. Around his neck, resting on top of his t-shirt, was the silver shield. He was no longer hiding in closets. He was a prince in his own castle. Every Friday night, the corner booth was reserved. At 6 o'clock sharp, the rumble would start, and a dozen bikes from the Iron Guardians would pull up. Grizz, Deacon, Rocco, Doc, and the others would file in, their leather vests a familiar, comforting sight. They were his uncles and his aunts, his council of guardians. They would order pie, drink coffee, and ask Leo about his math homework and his baseball team. They were his family, clear his throat. You see, this story was never really about a $10,000 tip. It wasn't even about a motorcycle club. Not truly. It's a story about how courage can come in the smallest of packages and how the desperate love of a son for his mother can be the most powerful force on earth. It's about how one small boy, with nothing but a story and a sliver of hope, can move mountains, or in this case, an army of angels on iron horses. We are taught to judge people by what we see on the surface. We see the tattoos, the leather, the skulls, and we build a story in our heads. We assume the worst. We cross the street. But this story, and so many others like it, reminds us of a profound truth. Heroes do not always wear capes. They don't always come in shining armor. Sometimes they wear worn-out leather and ride in a storm of chrome and steel. They are the guardians who stand watch when no one else will. The silent protectors who believe that family is a verb, an action, a promise kept. So I ask you, who is your family? Not just the one you were born with, but the one you have built, the one you would ride into the storm for? Tell us in the comments below who your protector was. The person who stood up for you when you couldn't, the one who was your shield. Every hero deserves to be named. And if you believe, as we do, that the strongest families are forged not in blood, but in loyalty and love, then hit that subscribe button. Stand with us. Become part of this family right here as we continue to share stories of the quiet heroes who walk among us. Because in a world that can often feel cold and frightening, it's good to be reminded that there are still guardians watching over us all.